I was around 13, my cousin, who was 12, and I decided we were going to camp out in the yard. Our families share the same stretch of land. It's been passed down for generations. Between our houses, there's about 150 yards of open field. Then it hits the creek, and beyond that, the forest. The whole property is about 2.5 square miles. Plenty of room to get lost if you wanted to. It was a warm summer night, the air was still, and we thought, why not camp out? So I grabbed an old tent from my parents' garage, and we spent the evening setting it up before heading to his house for dinner. By around 9, we decided to call it a night. It was getting dark, and there wasn't much to do outside besides talk. So we did about summer plans and dumb kid stuff. Around 11, my phone rang. It was my girlfriend at the time. She was upset about something that had happened earlier that day. I was half asleep, so it took me a while to calm her down, but once I did, we started chatting again, quietly, while my cousin lay next to me. Then, he grabbed my shoulder, hard. I whispered that I was on the phone, but he didn't say a word. He just turned my face toward him, and I saw the look in his eyes. Pure terror. He pressed his finger to his lips, shh, and pointed to the tent's entrance. I froze. I looked, but saw nothing. I told him to relax, maybe go back to sleep. But then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the tent. Out here, in the middle of our land, 10 miles from town, no one would be walking around at night. Except maybe my dad, but he's not the prank type. No one is. I told my cousin to stay low, and I peeked out the tent flap. Nothing. Just dark grass. Still air. I laid back down. The footsteps came again. Circling. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, changing rhythm like it was thinking. It went on for what felt like hours, then it stopped. A heavy silence settled over everything, the kind where you can hear your heartbeat in your ears. I stared toward the entrance, and that's when I saw it. A man, thin, filthy, standing just outside, watching us. He was almost completely naked, wearing nothing but tattered animal skins. His eyes, they glowed, like when you shine a flashlight at an animal, except there was no light. No reason for them to shine like that. We just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. After a moment, he stepped back, slowly, then turned and ran toward the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for the sound of him returning, but all I heard was the wind. Eventually, I drifted off. When we woke up, we searched around the tent. There were footprints, bare, human footprints, circling us, and next to them, paw prints. Coyote. We followed the trail out toward the field. Halfway there, the bare footprints began to change. First, handprints appeared, like someone walking on all fours. Then the prints grew smaller, thinner, until they were only paw prints. Coyote. We never forgot that night. Over the years, we've both seen and heard things on the property, things that reminded us of that man, or whatever he was. I never even knew the word skinwalker until months ago when I read another story online. The description was exactly what we saw, and ever since, I've been sure that's what it was. A skinwalker. But I don't see them anymore. Not near home, because in 2016, I saw something else, something bigger, something stronger. And I think whatever it was, it's keeping the skinwalkers away. Story 3. The thing at my grandparents' farm. Okay, so I've never really been one to believe in the paranormal, ghosts, cryptids, skinwalkers, all of that. I always thought it was people scaring themselves, you know? But there's something about my grandparents' farm, something that makes me question everything I used to believe. They own a huge piece of land in central Missouri. They've had it for about 40 years now, and I've been there maybe a dozen times in my life. Every single time, I feel it. That heavy silence, that feeling that something unseen is standing just behind me. It's not dramatic or loud. It's quiet, subtle, like eyes in the trees that never blink. And every visit, something strange happens. Not enough to make sense of, but enough to stay awake thinking about. The first time was when I was maybe 7 or 8. We had brought our family dog, Spot, a silver lab I loved more than anything. It was one of those bright, lazy summer days. The air smelled like grass and warm dirt, and the woods behind the house were calling to me like they always did. Spot was beside me, tail wagging, trotting through the brush, and then, all at once, he froze. His fur bristled. A deep, rumbling growl came out of him, a sound I'd never heard before. I stopped, turned around, But there was nothing there, just the trees and that feeling again. I crouched, squinting into the shadows, and then something shot out of the brush. Fast. So fast I barely caught its shape, gone in an instant. I remember sitting there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to understand what I'd just seen. It looked like a coyote, but the way it moved, it wasn't right. It was too fast, too quiet. And when I went to look where it had been lying, the ground was untouched. No broken grass, no mark. I went back inside and didn't say a word. My second encounter was a few years later. I was around 10. That same feeling of being watched hung around me all day, but I tried to ignore it. Night fell, and I was lying in the small twin bed that used to belong to my mom's brother. Then the tapping started. Not gentle taps, but heavy ones, like knuckles against glass. I turned to the window. Nothing. The field outside was still. The tapping stopped. 5 minutes passed, and just as I was about to drift off again, bang! The whole window shook. Something had slammed into it, hard. I bolted upright, my chest tight, and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. Shined it out the window. Nothing. No eyes, no movement, just the reflection of my own terrified face staring back. And then it screamed, a sound so sharp and unnatural that it sliced straight through the quiet of that Missouri night. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. It was something in between, a wet, ragged screech that made my blood feel cold in my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Just sat there, frozen, until instinct finally forced me to run to my mom's room. I didn't even wake her. I just curled beside her, trembling. Didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Even now, I can still hear that sound if I think about it long enough. Years passed before I went back again. I was 13 that time, old enough to convince myself that it was all just childish imagination. That evening, my grandpa asked if I wanted to go deer watching. I said yes. It was one of my favorite things to do with him. We took the Polaris out around dusk, the air warm and quiet, the fields painted gold by the setting sun. We drove east toward the far pasture. Half an hour went by, a few deer here and there, but not as many as usual. And then it started again. That feeling, that same creeping dread, like something was standing just over my shoulder. Close. Too close. I tried to brush it off, but when I looked at my grandpa, his whole face had changed. Normally, he's this easygoing man, always laughing, always calm. But in that moment, his hands were gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. His eyes kept darting around, scanning the tree line. Then, without a word, he spun the wheel in a sharp U-turn and hit the gas. I asked, "Grandpa, what's wrong?" He didn't even look at me, just said, in this low, cold voice, "We're going back to the house." I've only heard him sound like that once before, when my great-uncle died. There was something in his tone, like he'd seen something no one should see. He didn't slow down the entire way back, and when we reached the house, he hurried me inside, locking the door behind us. He kept glancing through the windows as if expecting something to follow. I finally asked, "Grandpa, what's going on?" He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. Then, in that same quiet voice, he said, "I guess it's time you knew." We sat at the kitchen table, the old clock ticking softly between us. He told me that whatever was on his land, whatever had been haunting me, had been there since the day he moved in. He said he and my mom had seen it too, back when she was a little girl, and it never liked visitors. He'd seen it, really seen it, more than once. He wouldn't tell me exactly what it looked like, just said it could take shapes, mimic things, but never perfectly. He said he always kept an eye on me when I visited because he knew it would notice me, that it always noticed new people. We talked for nearly half an hour, but his face stayed pale the entire time and his eyes kept drifting toward the window. Finally, he told me to sleep in my mom's room that night. We left the next morning, and I haven't been back since. But the story doesn't end there. Two things happened later, things that still make me wonder if it's still there, watching that land, waiting. The first was my sister's horse. We brought it to the farm for a few weeks to graze. The first night was rough. The horse wouldn't settle, kept pacing the fence line, snorting and stamping like something was out there. The next morning, my grandpa went out to feed it and saw deep gashes down its side. 3 of them, each about 10 inches long, too clean to be barbed wire, too deep for a branch. They said it must have been an accident, but I knew better. Then, not long after, they got a puppy, a little Jack Russell named Panda. 2 months old, playful, full of energy. 5 days later, they found him dead, a puncture wound in his side, his neck slashed. They said it was a bobcat, maybe a mountain lion, but even my grandpa didn't sound convinced when he said it. Now, when I think about that farm, I still get that same chill crawling up my spine, that same whisper of fear in the back of my mind. Whatever it is, it's still there. It's always been there. And something deep down tells me, if I ever go back, good things will not come. Story 4, The Smiling Skinwalker. Soft breath, a slow exhale. I've had this story written down for months now, but every time I tried to tell it, something in me froze. Maybe fear. Maybe the kind of dread that comes from knowing you've seen something you shouldn't have. Something not meant for human eyes. I kept it quiet because I thought, if I didn't speak it aloud, maybe it would stop being real. But it hasn't, and I don't think it ever will. So I'm telling it now, because maybe, just maybe, that's how I let it go. It all started when I moved west, from Oklahoma to Arizona. I wanted a change, something new, a place where the sunsets bled into the earth and the air carried that dry, endless quiet. I've always been a man of faith, a Christian, and I've never doubted that everything in this world can be explained by science, by reason, by the light of day. But this broke something in me, because I saw what shouldn't exist, and it smiled at me. It was December 23rd, 2018, 2 days before Christmas. My friends and I were in a little place north of Phoenix, out near the forests around a town called Pax. The air was razor cold that night, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones that makes you feel small beneath the weight of the desert sky. We wanted to light a bonfire, have a few drinks, sing carols off key, and celebrate the season the way we always did. But the moment I got in the car, I felt it, that unease. The one that starts in your stomach and slowly crawls upward, tightening around your ribs. It was as if the air itself was warning me not to go. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. Just one of those silly premonitions people get when they've had too much caffeine and not enough sleep. So I ignored it, and we drove on. The forest was darker than I remembered. The moon hung low, casting long, crooked shadows across the trail. We were about 5 or 6 miles north of town when we finally stopped. The others were already laughing, passing bottles between them, huddled around the small fire we built. But I couldn't shake the feeling, that memory, that something about this place was familiar. And then I realized why. I'd been here before, just a few weeks earlier, around Thanksgiving. Same stretch of trees, same cold, silent air. Back then, we'd come out for the same reason. A bonfire, a few drinks. I hadn't been drinking that night. I'd been the one gathering firewood, wandering just beyond the light's edge. That's when I saw it for the first time. It was just a flicker of movement at first, something darting between the trees. Tall, too tall. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The glow from the fire barely reached that far, but in the faintest shimmer of light, I could see the outline of something. Thin, elongated. Its movements strange. Not walking, but gliding, like a buoy rising and falling on unseen waves. I turned back toward my friends and called out, asking if anyone else saw it, but they just laughed. The sound of clinking bottles answered me. I looked back toward the trees. The figure was still there, just watching. I wanted to yell, to say something, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. It was like my voice had been stolen from me. My chest tightened. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then, in the blink of an eye, it moved. It shot off into the darkness so fast it made the world blur. I stumbled backward, fell into the dirt, and scrambled away like some frightened animal. When I told my friends what happened, they just laughed harder. Said I'd had too much, I hadn't had a drop. That night, I didn't leave the fire again, not once. Now, a month later, I was back. Same forest, same firelight, and that same quiet voice in my head telling me to leave. I tried to brush it off. It was Christmas, after all. Everyone was in high spirits, drunk and singing off-key. The sound of laughter echoed through the trees like the forest itself was mocking us. I wasn't drinking much that night. I never really did. Someone had to be the one to drive home when the party ended. But to calm my nerves, I took a small sip of Jaeger from the cooler, just enough to loosen the tightness in my chest. The fire crackled, the air shimmered, and for a little while, It felt almost peaceful until nature called. I told my friends I'd be right back and walked away from the fire, out toward a large rock behind a few fallen trees. Maybe 300 feet away, far enough for privacy, I could still hear them laughing behind me, their voices faint, slurring Christmas songs into the cold. And then I heard it. Someone calling my name. It was Corbin, one of my closest friends. He sounded just behind the rock. His tone was strange, though. Flat. Empty. I called back, telling him to hang on a second while I finished. Zipped up. Turned to walk around the rock, and stopped. It wasn't Corbin. It took my brain a moment to understand what I was seeing, to piece it together in the dim moonlight. The thing standing there was tall. Too tall. 6, maybe 7 feet. Its skin was stretched thin, almost glossy in the moonlight, and its eyes, they burned, just like our fire. It was crouched at first, like an animal. Then, with a slow, unnatural motion, it rose until it towered above me, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. It didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared. My knees went weak. Tears stung my eyes before I even realized I was crying. My mind couldn't comprehend it. It felt like time had stopped, like the world had fallen completely silent except for the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The only thought that came to me was simple, primal. Pray. So I did. Dropped to my knees in the dirt and began to pray, my words spilling out between choked sobs. But it didn't like that. The sound it made, I can still hear it. It was like someone screaming underwater, gasping and howling all at once, a sound that wasn't meant to exist. And then I ran. I don't even remember deciding to. My body just moved. Branches whipped across my face. The cold air burned my lungs. I tripped, fell, scrambled back to my feet, ran again. All I could think of was getting back to the fire, back to the light. When I stumbled into camp, I was covered in dirt, shaking, barely able to speak. My friends stared at me, some laughing, some silent. I tried to tell them what happened, what I'd seen, but the words came out broken, in gasps. I remember one of them saying, "Man, you're losing it." Another said, "You're drunk. Sit down." But I wasn't drunk. I was terrified. And I think for a moment my body just gave out. I remember falling, the firelight spinning above me. Then darkness. When I woke, it was morning. My phone was full of messages, some mocking, some worried. They said I'd had some kind of fit, that I'd fallen and started shaking, that I kept repeating one phrase over and over. He smiled at me. He smiled. Because that's what it did. Right before I ran, right before that scream, it smiled. Its mouth stretched far too wide, its teeth small and yellow and human, but the shape of that grin, it wasn't human at all. And I swear as it slipped back into the dark, it laughed. Not loud, just a soft, dry sound, like breath over bone. A few days after Christmas, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to tell someone who might understand. So I went into town and found an elder, a Navajo man I'd spoken to once before at a market. I didn't plan to bring it up, but when I did, he didn't laugh. He listened. His eyes didn't leave mine. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Then he said words I'll never forget. "You saw a skinwalker." He told me they are old, older than memory, older than faith, and that once one knows your face, it never forgets. He blessed me, prayed for me, and told me never to return to that place. Not ever. "Next time," he said softly, "you might not be so lucky." I didn't argue. Since that night, I've tried to move on. I really have. But sometimes, in the dark hours when the world feels too quiet, I feel it again, that presence. And when I look out my window, I swear I can see eyes in the trees, still burning, still watching. Sometimes I think about the way it smiled, about the way it mimicked Corbin's voice, about how easily it could have taken me that night. I tell myself it's just fear, that it's all in my head. But deep down, I know better. Because faith doesn't protect you from what isn't meant to be seen, and reason can't explain what hides between the trees. All I can say is this: for the love of everything holy, don't go looking for what you don't understand, because sometimes the things that find you don't let go. Even now, when the wind brushes the trees outside my window, I still hear him, that low, wet laughter, and I know he's still smiling. Sometimes, when I think back to that winter, I can still feel the quiet. It wasn't just ordinary quiet, like the hush of falling snow or the calm after a storm. No, it was something deeper. something that reached inside the bones of the forest and settled there, still and watchful. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried that kind of mystery, older than memory, older than stories. The people who live near them, who wake up with the fog clinging to the trees, who fall asleep to the sound of crickets and creek water, sometimes you just have to accept what you can't explain, because the mountains see things, and sometimes they let you see them back. I grew up in a little town that pressed right up against the edge of Pisgah National Forest. It's the kind of place where you know every dirt road by name, where waterfalls become your summer hangouts, and where the trees feel like old friends. Pisgah is beautiful, heartbreakingly so. In the summer, it glows green and alive, all moss and sunlight and wildflowers. But that day was nothing like summer. It was the middle of winter. I was 17, and I thought I was just going out to take pictures for my senior project. Nature photography. That's what I'd chosen. Simple, peaceful, a chance to get lost in the woods for a while and call it homework. I remember the way the cold air looked that morning. Gray, almost metallic. The sky hung low, and the bare branches reached up like ink lines against the clouds. Everything had that washed-out winter color, where the world feels like it's holding its breath. My mom had offered to drive me out to one of the trails we'd been to hundreds of times before, a safe, familiar spot. She trusted me to wander down for a bit, take my photos, then come back once I was done. And I remember feeling grown up, independent, like I was finally doing something that mattered. When she pulled over, I grabbed my camera and zipped my bright orange raincoat all the way up to my chin. The color stood out like a flare against the dull winter forest. You could have spotted me a mile away. The path was slick with old leaves and frozen mud, and the cold bit through my gloves as I made my way toward the river. That trail was one I'd known since childhood. A winding walk that led to a wide, stony bank, a place that filled with laughter and sunlight in the summer. But now it was all stillness, just the crunch of my boots and the low hum of the water somewhere ahead. When I reached the river, I crouched down near an old railroad spike half buried in the earth. It had been there for as long as I could remember, rusted, dark, a small piece of history swallowed by time. I leaned in close with my camera, framing the shot, adjusting the focus. The air smelled like cold stone and damp leaves, and then I realized there was no sound. No birds, no water, no wind, nothing. It was like the world had stopped breathing. You don't really notice the background noise of the woods until it disappears. When it does, you feel it. Your body feels it before your mind does. My chest tightened, my hands froze on the camera. I remember looking around, blinking through the blur of my not quite corrected vision. Everything looked the same, bare trees, dull river, gray sky, but it felt wrong. That's when the fear came. That deep, primal kind of fear that doesn't care about logic or reason. It just says, run. But I couldn't. Not yet, because something in me needed to understand what had just changed. And then I heard it. Crunch. Crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, from the other side of the river, the sound of something moving through the brittle underbrush. 2 feet, heavy enough to snap twigs. Close enough that I could hear the pattern of its gait. I lifted my head, eyes straining across the gray current. The trees on the far side were bare, skeletal. There was nothing to block my view. But between the trunks, something moved. Something tall. Something walking upright. It wasn't a person. It wasn't any shape I recognized. Its color, if you could call it that, was a washed-out gray, like the fog had taken form and learned to walk. I couldn't move. It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was like my body forgot how. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the rest of me was caught between disbelief and terror. The figure stepped closer, one deliberate stride at a time until it was almost at the riverbank. And then something broke. Maybe it was the trance. Maybe it was the survival instinct finally kicking in. Whatever it was, I turned and I ran. The forest blurred around me, branches whipping at my coat, the sound of my boots hammering against the frozen ground. I remember gasping, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think was, get to the car. When I burst out of the trailhead, my mom was already halfway out of the car. Her eyes wide, her face pale. I stumbled toward her, words tumbling out between gasps. She grabbed my arms, steadying me, asking what happened. When I told her, The color drained from her face even more. She said, and I'll never forget this, she said that just before I came running out, she'd suddenly felt a rush of panic, a heavy, choking sense that something was wrong. She was seconds away from coming to find me. That was enough for both of us. We didn't linger. We didn't even speak on the drive home. The silence followed us all the way back. It's been years since then. I'm older now. But that day, that silence, it's etched into me. Every time I go back to Pisgah, even on sunny days when the waterfalls sparkle and the trails are full of laughter, there's always this small part of me that listens for the quiet, that sudden stop in sound, that warning, because once you've heard it, you never forget it. My mom and I talked about it a few times after that. Always softly, like speaking too loud might bring it back. We never came up with an explanation. How could we? It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a trick of light. Something was there. My boyfriend says it could have been a skinwalker. Maybe. Or maybe it was something older than that. Something that's lived in those mountains long before we had names for things. I don't know. And honestly, I think I'm okay not knowing. Sometimes at night, when the wind hums low through the trees outside my window, I imagine that winter day again. The gray light, the breathless air, the quiet that swallowed everything. I can see myself crouched by that old railroad spike, camera in hand, orange coat bright against the gloom. I can see the way the forest stilled, the way the sound drained away, as if the mountains themselves were holding a secret. And maybe, just maybe, they still are. I think about what it means for a place to be that old. The Appalachians have been here longer than any of us can comprehend. They've seen civilizations rise and fall, species come and go, oceans dry up, and forests grow again. They've seen people live and die on their slopes. They've heard songs and prayers, and the footsteps of those who came long before roads or maps. It's not hard to imagine that, somewhere in all that history, some things never left. They just adapted. They learned to stay unseen. And sometimes when the world goes still enough, when the right kind of silence falls, they remind us. There's a special kind of reverence in fear. It makes you aware of being alive. It sharpens your senses, slows the moment down until every heartbeat feels like a lifetime. That's what that day was. Not just terror, not just confusion, but a kind of awe, like standing too close to something sacred. I think that's what the mountains wanted me to understand. I still have the photo from that day. The one I took right before the silence came. It's just a picture of a rusted railroad spike jutting out from the frozen earth, surrounded by gray stones and brittle leaves. But every time I look at it, I feel the air shift. I hear that absence of sound, and for a second I remember exactly what it felt like to be there. Small, alone, watched. I never went back to that exact spot. There are other trails, other rivers, other places where the forest feels lighter. But that one, it belongs to whatever was there that day. It's theirs now. And if the mountains really do keep memories, I hope they remember me kindly. So if you ever find yourself in Pisgah or anywhere deep in the Appalachian woods, and the air suddenly goes still and the sound fades away and every part of you goes alert, don't ignore it. But don't panic either. Just listen. Because maybe it's not danger. Maybe it's the mountains reminding you that you're standing somewhere ancient, somewhere alive. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll catch a glimpse of something you were never meant to see. And when you do, just remember to keep breathing. Step gently, leave quietly, and whatever you do, don't break the silence. That's the story of the winter I met the quiet in Pisgah Forest. I don't know what it was. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes as I drift towards sleep, I can still hear the crunch of footsteps on the other side of the river. Slow, measured, getting closer, and then nothing, just silence. Good night, friend. Sleep well and listen for what the woods might whisper back.